One British pound once commanded nearly $5, the undisputed throne of world finance. Today, it struggles at just over one. How did the global currency of empire become subordinate to the dollar? This is the story of how the US dollar dominated the British pound into submission, an economic battle with consequences that still shape every transaction on Earth. The answer begins with a rivalry most have never truly seen. In the heart of the 19th century, the British pound stood as the world's trusted measure of value. The secret to this dominance began in 1821, when Britain anchored its currency to gold. This commitment gave sterling a reputation for reliability, attracting merchants, bankers, and governments from every continent. London's merchant banks, names like Barings and Rothschilds, wove a financial web that reached across oceans, handling investments, underwriting loans, and managing the flow of capital for empires and young republics alike. The London Stock Exchange became the crossroads of global finance, where fortunes from India, Argentina, and the Canadian prairies changed hands under the watchful eye of British brokers. By 1913, Britain's net foreign assets had soared to between 150 and 200% of its own economic output. Nearly half of the world's foreign investments were managed from London, a scale unmatched by any rival. This network offered more than just capital. It provided stability. Transactions settled in sterling carried the weight of the Bank of England's gold vaults and the reputation of a navy that safeguarded shipping lanes from Shanghai to Cape Town. Even as other economies grew, the pound remained the currency of choice, not because Britain was the largest producer, but because its financial system was trusted to deliver on its promises. The pound's dominance was built on gold, confidence, and a global web of relationships that made London the banker to the world. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of empire was taking shape. By the late 1800s, the United States had surged ahead of Britain in economic output, powered by vast reserves of coal, iron, and oil. American factories turned out steel, locomotives, and textiles at a scale the world had never seen. The U.S. population exploded from 38 million in 1870 to over 76 million by 1900, feeding a workforce that made America the largest single market on the planet. Railroads stitched together cities and farms from coast to coast, while new industries, oil in Pennsylvania, automobiles in Detroit, finance in New York, fueled a relentless drive for growth. In 1879, the United States anchored its currency to gold, sending a clear message to the world: the dollar could be trusted. This move gave American money a stamp of credibility, but it was still the newcomer in global finance. Most international deals continued to flow through London, where old networks and established trust kept the pound at the center. Yet the numbers told a different story. By the turn of the century, the U.S. economy accounted for nearly a quarter of global output, outpacing Britain in both total size and productivity per person. Wall Street, once a provincial outpost, was starting to draw the attention of foreign investors. American banks financed railways in Latin America, mines in Canada, and even loans to European governments. The stage was set. America had the economic muscle, the gold reserves, and a growing appetite for global influence. All it needed was the right moment to turn this latent power into financial dominance. World War I unleashed a financial storm that battered the British Treasury. In just 5 years, government debt soared from £650 million in 1914 to $7.4 billion by 1919, a 12-fold leap that dwarfed anything in British history. The cost of war consumed the equivalent of 125% of the nation's pre-war economy, draining coffers faster than they could be refilled. To pay for munitions, food, and ships, Britain turned to Wall Street and Washington, borrowing on terms set by America. Gold, once the bedrock of London's credibility, began its silent exodus across the Atlantic. Shipments of bullion, tracked in ledgers and guarded by naval convoys, left British vaults for New York, swelling American reserves. At the same time, the government ordered the sale of overseas assets, railways in Argentina, securities in the United States, and plantations across the empire, often at deep discounts. By the war's end, the world's banker had become a debtor, and the pound's foundation was cracked. The balance of financial power was already leaning west. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a fateful decision. He restored the pound to its pre-war gold value. The move was meant to signal strength and restore London's prestige, but it set sterling at an exchange rate few believed sustainable. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most influential economist, warned that overvaluing the pound would crush British exports and deepen unemployment. His criticism proved prophetic. Struggling under the weight of war debts and a rigid currency, Britain's economy limped through the 1920s. The Great Depression only tightened the vice. By 1931, a run on the pound forced Britain off the gold standard entirely, a blow to confidence that echoed through markets worldwide. With its currency untethered, Britain tried to hold its empire together by forming the sterling area, binding much of the Commonwealth to the pound. But this was no substitute for lost credibility. The interwar years exposed the pound's vulnerability as policy missteps and mounting debt left Britain unprepared for the financial storms ahead. The outbreak of World War II forced Britain to dismantle the last pillars of its financial empire. In September 1939, the Emergency Powers Act gave the government sweeping authority to seize and liquidate overseas assets. Railways in Argentina, plantations in Malaya, and blue-chip stocks in New York were sold off under Treasury orders, often at a fraction of their pre-war value. The ledgers tell the story. By 1945, Britain had surrendered nearly two-thirds of its pre-war overseas investments. The American Viscose Corporation and Caribbean sugar plantations changed hands at discounts as steep as 40%. Each sale meant a permanent loss of income that once supported sterling's global reach. While the British government scrambled to raise dollars, American factories shifted into overdrive. By the war's end, the United States accounted for more than half of the world's manufactured goods and controlled two-thirds of its gold reserves. Lend-Lease aid kept British industry afloat, but every shipment arrived with new obligations. When the war ended, Britain owed £3.7 billion, but held just £620 million in reserves. The world's former banker now depended on American credit and American terms. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered in the quiet woods of New Hampshire. At the head of the American team stood Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official with a vision for a new world order. The plan he championed would peg the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce, while every other major currency, including the British pound, would be fixed to the dollar, not to gold itself. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, would oversee the system. Britain, exhausted and short of gold, had no leverage to resist. The legal framework of Bretton Woods wrote American monetary power into the foundation of global finance. For the first time, the dollar became the anchor by design, not by default. In July 1947, Britain threw open the doors of sterling convertibility, pegging the pound at $4.03. The world's response was swift and merciless. Holders of sterling rushed to exchange their balances for dollars, draining Britain's reserves by hundreds of millions in a matter of weeks. The experiment collapsed in just 6 weeks. Convertibility suspended, faith in the pound shattered. 2 years later, the British government conceded defeat, slashing the pound's value overnight to $2.80. The world had watched as sterling's reputation unraveled, leaving no doubt that the dollar now set the terms of global finance. President Eisenhower reached for financial levers, not military ones, As the Suez Crisis unfolded, the U.S. blocked emergency IMF loans to Britain, sending a clear warning through State Department cables. If London persisted, Washington could flood the markets with its sterling reserves, collapsing the pound overnight. Faced with the threat of a currency meltdown and no access to international support, Britain stood down. By 1957, sterling accounted for only 36% of global reserves. The dollar's supremacy was no longer just economic, it was enforced by raw monetary power. In 1914, one British pound was worth nearly $5. Today it trades around $1.35. This collapse traces back to two world wars, forced asset sales, and mounting debts that drained Britain's financial power. By 1945, the U.S. held two-thirds of global gold reserves and produced over half the world's manufactured goods, while Britain faced £3.7 billion in debt with only £620 million in reserves. Archival records show how the pound's reputation suffered further with the failed 1947 convertibility and the 1956 Suez Crisis, when American threats exposed Britain's dependence. The pound, once the foundation of global trade, became a minor reserve currency. Still, some documents on U.S.-UK negotiations remain classified, leaving parts of this financial transition obscured. Today, the dollar accounts for about 60% of global reserves and 88% of currency trades, making America's dominance clear in every central bank ledger. History proves economic and military strength, when institutionalized, shapes the world's money.